I always imagined myself escaping the chaos of city life, even if just for a weekend. Somewhere quiet, with a little cabin, the sound of waves, and maybe a fishing pole in hand. I never thought I'd stumble onto something that seemed too good to be true, yet there it was, a tiny, weathered fishing cabin sitting at the edge of a private-looking beach. Its brown paint was peeling, the roof had a few missing shingles, and the wood creaked in a way that suggested the house had stories to tell. It smelled faintly of old seaweed and damp wood, which, I decided, was part of the charm. The first day, I drove down the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, carrying a mix of excitement and skepticism. The trees leaned over the path like watchful sentinels, and the smell of hit me before I even saw the ocean. I parked my old pickup in front of the cabin and took a deep breath. The wind was gentle, the seagulls were lazily circling above, and for a moment, I felt like I had found paradise. I could already picture lazy mornings on the porch, coffee in one hand, a fishing rod in the other. This was exactly what I had been looking for. Then, as I stepped out of the truck and stretched my legs, I noticed a small metal gate at the end of the road with a faded sign. Something about HOA rules and private community enforcement caught my eye. I squinted at it, trying to remember if anyone had mentioned a homeowners association during the sale. The realtor had been vague. I brushed it off. A sign was a sign, right? Nothing serious. I spent the next hour unpacking my fishing gear, humming to myself, trying to ignore the faint creak of the cabin settling. Everything seemed normal, almost blissfully quiet. That is, until I heard a knock at the door. Not a polite knock, the kind that announces a neighborly visit. No, this knock was deliberate, sharp, almost demanding. I froze for a moment, glancing at the window. Two men in black uniforms were standing there, arms crossed, faces serious. One of them had that "I've seen everything and I don't care" expression that immediately sets off every instinct in you. I swallowed hard. My mind raced. Had I parked in the wrong spot? Did I unknowingly break some obscure rule? My heart pounded as I opened the door. "Good morning," I said cautiously, trying to sound casual. "Homeowners Association Security," one of them replied flatly, without smiling. "We're here to address violations on this property." I blinked. Violations? I had literally just arrived. I just moved in, I don't think I. Before I could finish, they held up a small clipboard, checking off boxes as if my presence alone was a problem. And then, almost like a dramatic entrance in a bad movie, she appeared. Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA president. She was everything you imagine someone like that to be. Sharp blazer, impeccable hair, and eyes that could cut glass. She didn't shake my hand, didn't introduce herself in a friendly way. She just started listing rules, dock rules, mailbox rules, paint rules, lawn rules, even the angle at which a flag could fly. I tried to smile, tried to explain that I had just moved in, that I hadn't even hung my curtains yet. She didn't care. She had already made up her mind. Her voice was firm, her words precise. I realized that she thought this little cabin, this weekend escape, belonged to her jurisdiction and that I was intruding. And then came the line that made my stomach drop. "If you don't comply, we'll have to involve the authorities." I laughed nervously. Authorities? Over a crooked mailbox and a cabin that hadn't been touched in decades. I had no idea that my quiet little fishing retreat was about to become the center of a full-blown HOA showdown. I stepped back, trying to gauge the situation. For now, the guard stood at the gate, unwavering, and Karen's eyes were fixed on me like a hawk. I could feel tension crackling in the air, a storm before the first drop of rain. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just about property lines or rules. This was going to be a battle of wills, and little did I know, it was only the beginning. I barely had time to process the knock before she arrived. Karen, the self-appointed ruler of the beach. She strutted down the path toward me as if she owned not just the cabin, but the sun, the sand, and the very air I was breathing. Her heels crunched against the gravel, and with each step I felt smaller. She didn't even pause to introduce herself politely. Instead, she launched directly into a lecture. "You're in violation of multiple HOA rules," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through the morning air. "Your dock isn't aligned with our specifications. your mailbox is unacceptable, and your curtains, well, let's just say they don't meet our aesthetic standards." I blinked. Curtains. I had barely unpacked, and somehow my choice of fabric had already offended the HOA gods. I opened my mouth to protest, but she wasn't finished. "Also, the paint on your cabin is not uniform, the siding is uneven, and your yard is entirely wrong. It needs pruning, landscaping, and a proper decorative rock arrangement. Immediately." I wanted to laugh. I really did. It sounded like a checklist from a home decor reality show, not a real complaint about a tiny, creaky cabin on the edge of a quiet beach. But there she was, standing in front of me, unwavering, as serious as a general issuing orders to a battalion. I swallowed hard and tried a gentle approach. "I just moved in. I haven't had a chance to settle things yet, and honestly, I didn't even know about some of these rules." Her eyes narrowed. "Ignorance is no excuse. The rules are clear. You are expected to comply immediately. Failure to do so will result in—" And then she said it, the words that made my stomach sink. "Police involvement." I forced a laugh, though it came out more like a nervous cough. "Police involvement, over a crooked mailbox?" I asked. "Yes," she said, utterly deadpan. "And the dock, the curtains, the paint, and your landscaping." I could feel the tension in the air. The seagulls seemed to quiet, the waves paused, and I realized the entire beach was holding its breath, waiting for this absurd confrontation to escalate. I decided to step back and assess my options. I could argue, but I quickly learned that Karen wasn't interested in discussion. She had a plan, and she was following it to the letter. I noticed her clipboard, filled with notes and checkboxes, each one carefully marking my alleged infractions. It was clear she had done this before, probably dozens of times. But something about me, something about this cabin, made her target especially personal. The guards behind her didn't move, didn't offer a smile or a friendly suggestion. They were statues, silent and imposing, enforcing her authority without a word. I realized then that this wasn't a friendly HOA dispute. It was an organized mission, and I was the unexpected obstacle in her perfectly ordered world. I tried a different approach. "Look, I don't want trouble. I just want to enjoy my cabin and the beach. I don't even know all the rules yet." Karen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried an edge. "Rules aren't suggestions. They are mandatory, and enforcement is very serious." My mind raced. I had spent years researching property, reading deeds, understanding local laws. I knew my ownership was solid, but something about the way she said enforcement made it feel like she expected the entire police force to descend on my little retreat. Humor crept into my panic. Here I was, day one at my dream cabin, being scolded for curtains and a crooked dock, while she acted like I was some kind of criminal mastermind. The absurdity of it all almost made me chuckle. Almost. And then it hit me. If she was willing to call the cops over this, I needed to make sure I had all my ducks in a row. My ownership documents, my property deeds, everything. Because this wasn't just about rules anymore. This was about control. I nodded politely, hiding my inner panic. "Of course," I said, "I'll make sure everything is in order." She gave a tight-lipped smile and turned away, as if she had already won. But I could see it in her eyes. There was no satisfaction in this victory yet. This was only the first round, and something told me the next moves would be even more dramatic. As she walked back toward the gate, clipboard in hand, I took a deep breath and stared out at the water. Calm, peaceful, untouched by HOA rules, at least for now. I had a feeling this beach, my little dream escape, was about to become the stage for one of the strangest battles of my life. I barely had time to process Karen's parting glare before the sound of engines cut through the peaceful hum of the beach. At first, I thought it was just another delivery truck or maybe someone checking the area. But no. 2 patrol cars rolled up the dirt road, tires crunching against gravel, lights off but the presence impossible to ignore. My heart started racing. This was exactly what Karen had threatened: police involvement. I hadn't even unpacked all my gear, and already my weekend escape had turned into a legal showdown. I glanced at the cabin, then at the guards at the gate, who stood stiffly like statues, silently daring me to make a move. The first officer stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the sand. He was tall, professional, and polite, but his eyebrows shot up when he took in the scene. Me, standing in front of a weathered cabin, two men in black uniforms, and Karen, clipboard in hand, radiating authority like she owned the entire county. "Good morning, sir," the officer said, nodding politely. "We received a complaint about possible violations." I swallowed hard and gestured toward Karen. "This is, well, she's the HOA president. I just moved in. I don't even know what violations she's talking about." Karen stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as if I had just committed a crime. "He is in violation of multiple HOA rules," she said, as though repeating the same checklist from the previous day would magically convince the officer. "Dock alignment, mailbox, curtains, yard maintenance." The officer raised an eyebrow, then glanced at his partner. There was that subtle, silent conversation people have without speaking, a look that said, "Really? This is what we're here for." Humor bubbled up despite my nerves. I could almost see the thought balloon over the officer's head, two grown adults arguing over curtains, on a beach. I stepped forward, trying to keep my voice calm. "Officer, I just moved in. I wasn't aware of any of these rules. I honestly haven't even had time to settle." Karen huffed, "Ignorance is no excuse. Enforcement is mandatory." The officers exchanged another glance. One of them discreetly reached for his notebook, probably preparing to write a report that would make the HOA look absurd. My mind raced. I knew my deed was ironclad, but I hadn't planned on pulling it out in front of the cops just yet. I had hoped for a calm introduction, not a courtroom drama on day one. Then Karen did what I hadn't expected. She turned to the officers and added, almost casually, "If he refuses to comply, we may need to take further action." My stomach sank. "Further action," I echoed, trying not to sound panicked. "Yes," she said, completely straight-faced. "Police intervention." I forced a laugh. Police intervention over a crooked mailbox and a slightly tilted dock. One officer coughed politely, glancing at Karen as if to say, "You have got to be kidding me." She didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care. She was on a mission, and nothing would stop her, not reason, not logic, not even common sense. I realized then that the moment had arrived. I needed to calmly assert my position without escalating the situation. I reached into my bag, feeling for the folder I had tucked away, filled with property deeds and ownership documents. My pulse raced as I prepared to explain, carefully, politely, that my ownership of the cabin wasn't just valid, it included the beach itself. The tension in the air was palpable. The guards at the gate shifted slightly, probably sensing that things were about to change dramatically. Karen, oblivious to my inner plan, continued her tirade, listing rules that sounded increasingly absurd with every word. Then I took a breath and said, "Officers, I believe the situation is a misunderstanding. I own this property, including the beach. I can show you the deed." The silence was immediate. Karen froze, her pen hovering over the clipboard. The guards straightened, as if bracing for impact. The officers exchanged a long look, and for a brief moment, I imagined I could hear the gears turning in their heads. This isn't a violation. This is ownership. Humor and disbelief mingled in my chest. Here I was, standing in front of a tiny fishing cabin, two cops, two guards, and the self-appointed HOA queen, about to reveal the truth that would turn the entire encounter upside down. But I didn't rush. I let the pause stretch, letting the tension build, letting Karen squirm just enough to feel the power shift. This was my moment. And as I reached for the folder, I realized the real drama, the real fun, was only just beginning. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. This was it, the moment I had been preparing for, even if I hadn't realized it until now. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder containing all the paperwork, the deeds, the property surveys, and the official documents proving that this tiny, weathered cabin wasn't just mine. It came with ownership of the entire stretch of beach that Karen and her HOA were so obsessed with controlling. Karen's eyes narrowed as she noticed the folder. "What's that?" she asked sharply, leaning forward, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Just some paperwork," I said casually, although my heart was pounding. "I think it might clear up this little misunderstanding." I opened the folder and pulled out the first page, the deed. I handed it to the officer closest to me. His eyes flicked down, and I could see his expression shift from polite confusion to incredulity. I handed a copy to the second officer, then, with a calm I was nowhere near feeling, looked Karen squarely in the eye. "You see this?" I said. "It clearly states that I own this property, including the cabin, the dock, and yes, the beach, all of it. The waterline, the sand, everything. Legally, this is my land." Karen's confident expression faltered. I could almost see the wheels spinning in her head. She opened her mouth, probably to argue, but no words came out. For a moment, I think she genuinely didn't know what to say. Her face went from smugness to disbelief in the blink of an eye. The officers were now fully engaged. They flipped through the documents, comparing survey maps with their surroundings. One officer looked at me and then at Karen, raising an eyebrow that seemed to silently say, "I think you're about to lose this battle." I took a step closer to the waterline, letting my gaze sweep across the sand and the small waves lapping at the shore. "This isn't just a cabin," I said, my voice steady. "It's my property. You can check the records if you want. Everything is in order." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. I noticed her hands tremble slightly as she gripped her clipboard. She opened her mouth again, but this time it was a quiet, defeated, she couldn't finish the sentence. She had no argument left. I allowed myself a small, quiet laugh. It wasn't mean-spirited, just the release of tension after days of anticipation, and in this case, minutes of confrontation. "I'm happy to provide copies of all the documents," I added, "so there's absolutely no confusion. The officers can confirm it if needed." The tension shifted palpably. The officers, now clearly understanding the situation, exchanged looks and nodded subtly. Karen's guards shuffled their feet, probably realizing that their intimidation tactics were now useless. The entire dynamic had flipped. What had started as a high-stakes confrontation over curtains and docks had turned into a legal reality check. I own the beach, and no amount of clipboard waving could change that. Humor crept back in, this time in the form of quiet observation. I noticed Karen's perfectly polished shoes scuffing against the sand as if the earth itself was rejecting her authority. The wind tugged at her blazer, the seagulls above seemed to mock her. Even the officers, trying to remain professional, had the faintest glimmer of amusement in their eyes. I leaned slightly toward the officers and whispered, "It might be worth noting, this beach is also private property. Trespassing laws apply, even to HOA presidents." Karen's face turned a shade of red that almost matched her clipboard. I could see the frustration building, but I remained calm, letting the reality of my ownership settle like a weight in the air. This wasn't arrogance, it was simply stating the facts. The officers nodded again, and one finally said, "Looks like this property belongs to you. There's nothing here that requires our intervention." The tension lifted slightly, though Karen didn't move. She simply stared, mouth slightly open, clearly trying to process the revelation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here she was, armed with rules and authority, yet utterly powerless in the face of a legal deed. I carefully closed the folder, tucking it back into my bag. I smiled politely at Karen. "I think we can call this a misunderstanding. I'd like to enjoy my property peacefully from now on, just as anyone else would." She didn't respond. She just backed toward the gate, muttering something about checking regulations and contacting lawyers. The officers gave me one last nod, then returned to their cars, leaving me with my cabin, my beach, and the first taste of victory. For the first time since arriving, I felt truly at ease. The battle wasn't over. Karen would find ways to try and assert control, But for now, the beach, my sanctuary, and the cabin were undeniably mine, and that was exactly how I intended to keep it. For a few days after the deed revelation, I thought I might finally enjoy some peace. I imagined lazy mornings on the porch, coffee in hand, seagulls circling overhead, and the gentle sound of waves lapping at the shore. But peace, as I was quickly reminded, was never part of the HOA playbook. Karen, apparently unwilling to accept reality, escalated her tactics. First came the emails, pages and pages of them, detailing potential fines, mandatory compliance deadlines, and legal consequences for, as far as I could tell, existing. The messages were filled with official-sounding language and phrases like immediate corrective action required and failure to comply will result in severe repercussions. I couldn't help but laugh. Severe repercussions, over a crooked mailbox, a slightly tilted dock, and maybe, I thought wryly, my unfortunate choice of curtains. I read through the emails, each one more ridiculous than the last, imagining Karen furiously typing, her finger jabbing at the keyboard like she was conducting a personal military operation against me and my weekend retreat. Then came the letters. Thick, official-looking envelopes arrived almost daily. I stacked them on the counter, a small tower of threats and warnings, each one more absurd than the last. Some included diagrams and instructions, like how to angle the dock at precisely 2.3 degrees or how to prune a shrub according to HOA-approved standards. I even found a note about preferred sand color on the beach. I couldn't stop myself from shaking my head. I had legally purchased the entire beach, yet Karen was still trying to micromanage my property like a drill sergeant. Not to be outdone, she sent more guards to patrol the area. They would show up at odd times, checking the dock, taking notes on my yard, and occasionally standing at the water's edge with binoculars as if they were mapping illegal fishing activity. The absurdity of it all became almost comical, yet there was an undercurrent of tension. Every visit was a reminder that she was still trying, in her own way, to assert control. I decided to take a subtle, strategic approach. I wasn't going to engage in petty arguments or let her ridiculous rules ruin my enjoyment of the property. Instead, I started putting up signs around the beach. Private property, enjoy the water, respect the boundaries, and a smaller, cheeky one near the dock that read, no HOA intrusions allowed. It was part humor, part warning, and part assertion of ownership. I also began documenting everything, photos of the property, the waterline, the dock, and yes, even the letters and emails. I knew that if she tried any legal maneuvers, I would be prepared. There was something empowering about keeping a record, about knowing that no amount of paperwork from Karen could override the legal ownership I held. Of course, Karen didn't give up easily. She escalated again with what I can only describe as creative enforcement attempts. One day, she tried to block access to the beach by ordering temporary fencing and posting signs claiming certain areas were restricted. I calmly moved the signs and fences back to the edge of the HOA's actual land, making sure everything stayed within legal boundaries. Each time she tried something new, I responded with calm precision, letting her overreach fail without direct confrontation. Humor became a survival tool. I imagined her furiously typing letters, checking rules, and packing the property while I fished quietly, brewed coffee, or read on the porch. Each attempt she made to control the beach only highlighted the absurdity of her obsession. It was almost like a game of chess, except one player didn't realize the other had already won by owning the board. The tension simmered. I knew that eventually we would have a direct confrontation again. Karen's persistence wasn't going to fade overnight. But by maintaining calm, documenting everything, and asserting my rights subtly, I was slowly turning her aggression into impotence. Every letter she sent, every guard she deployed, every ridiculous rule she enforced, all of it was met with a quiet, unshakable confidence that the beach, the cabin, and the waves belonged to me. And somewhere in the middle of all this, I realized something important. Winning wasn't about fighting fire with fire. It was about staying calm, staying prepared, and letting the absurdity of the situation work in my favor. Karen could escalate, she could threaten, she could post signs and hire guards, but she couldn't change the fact that this was my land, my beach, and my sanctuary. For now, that thought alone was enough. The stage was set for the next showdown, and I had no doubt that when it came, I would be ready. It was a sunny Saturday morning, the kind of day that usually promises peace, quiet, and the gentle rhythm of waves. But this morning felt different. I had a feeling in my gut that Karen wasn't done. As I stepped outside with my coffee, I noticed her heels crunching on the gravel, clipboard in hand, her guards trailing behind like a miniature army. The expression on her face told me everything. She had a plan, and she intended to enforce it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I had my deeds in my bag, my camera ready, and my confidence slowly building. For weeks, I had documented every letter, every guard visit, every absurd rule she had tried to enforce. Today, it would all come to a head. "Good morning," I said calmly, stepping onto the sand. My voice was steady, but I could feel my heart racing. "I see you're out early." Karen's eyes narrowed. "I'm here to ensure compliance," she said firmly, her voice cutting across the quiet morning. "This is private property, but it's within HOA jurisdiction, and you are clearly not following our rules." I smiled politely, letting her tension build just a little. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You see, the rules don't exactly apply to me in the way you think." Her eyebrows shot up. "Oh." I reached into my bag and pulled out the deed, the official survey maps, and copies of property ownership documentation. I held them calmly in front of her. "This property, including the cabin, the dock, and the entire beach, is mine. Legally. Fully. No HOA regulation can override that." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked to her guards, as if hoping one of them would correct me or explain why this was all somehow a misunderstanding. But their faces were blank. They had no answers. I stepped closer to the waterline, letting my gaze sweep across the sand and surf, letting the calmness of the beach reinforce my confidence. "Everything here," I said, "from the cabin to the water to the sand under our feet, belongs to me. You can check with the county if you'd like. I've kept copies of everything, as you can see." Karen blinked rapidly, her poise starting to crack. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. There were no words. All of her carefully constructed rules, all of her threats, all of her emails and patrols suddenly felt meaningless in the face of undeniable legal proof. Humor crept in, despite the tension. I couldn't help but notice how ridiculous she looked trying to assert control over a beach she didn't own. The heels sinking slightly into the sand, the clipboard shaking in her hands, and the way her guards shifted uneasily, it all seemed almost theatrical. I allowed myself a small, quiet chuckle. Karen's frustration was palpable. She straightened her posture, trying to regain authority, but it was clear the momentum had shifted. I could see it in the way her eyes darted between the papers in my hand, the officers she had previously summoned, and the sand stretching endlessly before us. I handed the deed to one of her guards, just enough to make them read the fine print. "I'd like to enjoy this beach in peace," I said, keeping my tone polite, "without unnecessary visits, emails, or patrols. I hope we can agree on that." Karen's face went red, then pale. She opened her mouth, but only a small muttered protest escaped. She realized, finally, that she had no leverage here. No fines, no patrols, no rules could override the fact that this was my property. The officers who had accompanied us, or perhaps just stopped by from previous visits, now stood silently, clearly understanding the situation. One of them gave a small nod, as if confirming silently that this confrontation had already been decided. I took a step back, letting the tide lap gently at the sand, and allowed the silence to sink in. The confrontation had been handled without escalation, yet the shift in power was undeniable. Karen's attempts at intimidation had failed, her authority by the simple fact of ownership. Humor and satisfaction intertwined as I watched her retreat slightly, muttering under her breath. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The quiet victory of the moment was enough. For the first time, the beach, the cabin, and the water felt entirely mine. The confrontation had ended, but I knew there would be more skirmishes. Karen's persistence was legendary after all. Yet for this moment, I stood on my sand, coffee in hand, surveying my beach with a quiet smile. The confrontation was over, and I had emerged unshaken, armed with nothing but the truth and a folder of deeds. This was my beach. My cabin, my victory. Just when I thought the ordeal might be over, Karen returned with a vengeance I hadn't fully anticipated. It was a gray, windy morning, the kind that makes the waves crash a little louder and the seagulls squawk more insistently. I spotted her vehicle parked conspicuously near the entrance to the beach, and my gut told me this wasn't another routine patrol. This was escalation, pure and simple. By the time I stepped outside, she was already orchestrating her little army of HOA enforcers, packing back and forth with that clipboard clutched like a sword. Her face was red with frustration, her eyes narrowing into laser beams aimed directly at me. Whatever restraint she had left had evaporated overnight. She approached, speaking in a tone that was somewhere between managerial authority and battlefield command. "We've reviewed your property again," she said, "and we are prepared to escalate further. Legal action will commence if necessary." I raised an eyebrow. "Legal action, against whom?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "I own the property, remember. That includes the beach, the cabin, and technically, this sand you're standing on." Her jaw tightened. She opened her mouth, paused, and then sputtered something about constructive compliance and community enforcement. I had no idea what that meant, but I had the feeling it wasn't going to change anything. Karen's final tactic was audacious. She attempted to erect a temporary fence across the main entrance to the beach, claiming it was to protect HOA property boundaries, while simultaneously blocking access to my own land. The guards moved to set it up, measuring tape in hand, trying to look professional. I could only shake my head at the absurdity. I walked over slowly, hands raised in a gesture of calm authority. "That fence," I said, "is technically on my property." I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the momentary pause where reality finally clashed with her obsession. "I'm sure you didn't mean to trespass, but this has to come down." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded stiffly, though I could tell it wasn't surrender. It was frustration masquerading as civility. The guards reluctantly moved the fencing back, and I couldn't resist letting a small, satisfied smirk cross my face. Humor lightened the tension as I watched Karen packing in circles, muttering about regulations, rules, and some obscure sand alignment policy I didn't even know existed. I stood calmly, watching the absurd spectacle unfold. The sheer determination she had poured into controlling a property she didn't own was almost impressive, almost. Still, Karen wasn't finished. She pulled out yet another stack of papers, apparently hoping to overwhelm me with more threats, fines, and enforcement notices. I took them gently, flipping through a few with exaggerated interest before calmly placing them aside. They were redundant, unenforceable, and entirely irrelevant. I realized then that her persistence was her only weapon, and even that was losing its edge. With a deep breath, I decided it was time to assert authority in the most subtle but firm way possible. I stepped toward her, holding the deed folder just enough for her to see. "Karen, this is my property," I said, keeping my tone polite yet unwavering. "All of it. The cabin, the beach, the waterline. You can hire all the guards in the world, post signs, and send letters, but none of it changes the fact that I own this land. And I intend to enjoy it." Her face shifted from frustration to disbelief. I could see her planning another argument, but her words caught in her throat. The absurdity of her situation was undeniable. A woman who had spent weeks trying to control a beach that wasn't hers, facing the simple, unassailable truth of ownership. Finally, she stopped packing. Her guards looked uneasy, realizing that their enforcement mission had failed. I stepped back, letting the wind and waves underscore the calm authority I now held. I had won, not through confrontation, but through patience, preparation, and the simple power of proof. Humor mingled with satisfaction as I watched her retreat slightly, muttering under her breath. The dramatic, over-the-top fight that had consumed my life for weeks was finally losing momentum. I knew this wasn't the end. She might try a few more desperate moves, but her last attempt had failed spectacularly. As I stood there, surveying the beach I had fought so quietly but fiercely to protect, I realized something important. Persistence matters, but patience, preparation, and knowing your rights matters even more. Karen had tried to control what wasn't hers, but truth and legality had a way of prevailing, even against the most relentless opposition. For the first time in weeks, I could feel the tide at my back and the sun on my face without a nagging sense of looming confrontation. The beach, the cabin, and the waves were mine, and I intended to enjoy every second. The days after Karen's last desperate attempt felt almost surreal. I woke up one morning to the gentle sound of waves, the seagulls calling overhead, and most importantly, no sign of HOA patrols, guards, or frantic emails waiting in my inbox. For the first time since moving in, I could breathe, and not in that cautious, watch-your-back way. I stepped out onto the sand, coffee in hand, and took a long, slow walk along the waterline. The beach stretched out endlessly, peaceful and untouched, and I couldn't help but smile. Every footprint in the sand was mine to leave. Every wave that lapped at the shore belonged to me. After weeks of conflict, absurdity, and high-stakes confrontation, I had finally achieved the quiet I had been dreaming of. Humor bubbled up as I recalled the past few weeks. The emails demanding dock adjustments, the notes about sand color, the guards standing stiffly like statues, and Karen packing back and forth as if the tides themselves were her enemy. It all seemed almost comical now. I could imagine a narrator in a dramatic movie voice. And so, the mighty HOA queen was bested by the quiet power of legal deeds and a calm mind. Yet it hadn't been easy. The tension, the worry, the constant monitoring, it had all taken a toll. But I had learned something invaluable. Patience and preparation trumped panic and aggression every time. I had stood my ground calmly, documented everything meticulously, and let the undeniable facts speak for themselves. And now, finally, I could enjoy the fruits of that strategy. I spent the morning cleaning up the dock, straightening a few boards, and arranging my fishing gear. Everything felt like it belonged exactly where it should, and the peaceful rhythm of the beach reinforced that this was my sanctuary. The sea stretched out endlessly, the waves catching sunlight and sparkling like a million tiny diamonds. I could almost hear a gentle applause from the ocean itself. Later, I walked down to the edge of the property where Karen had tried to post her signs. They were gone, removed. I assumed by her begrudging acceptance that she had no authority here. I chuckled to myself, imagining her returning with yet another set of rules, only to realize that the entire beach and cabin were legally mine. Persistence, she might have had, but persistence without authority is just noise. As I stood there, I reflected on the whole ordeal. The battles, the tension, the humor, and the absurdity all came together to form a story I would remember for a lifetime. It wasn't just about a cabin or a beach. It was about knowing your rights, asserting them calmly, and maintaining confidence in the face of overreach. It was a lesson in patience, strategy, and quiet triumph. I spent the afternoon fishing, enjoying the sun warming my face, and feeling the satisfaction of finally being left alone. The waves rolled in rhythmically, each one reminding me that this was my place, my property, my retreat. I laughed quietly, thinking about Karen and her relentless attempts to micromanage a beach that wasn't hers. The absurdity of it all was almost poetic. By evening, the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. I sat on the porch of the cabin, my feet dangling over the wooden railing, watching the tide come and go. The peace I had fought for was finally mine. No threats, no letters, no guards, just the quiet lapping of the waves and the faint cry of seagulls. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. Karen's attempts to control me and my property had failed, and they would continue to fail, as long as I stayed calm, prepared, and steadfast. This cabin, this beach, was my escape, my sanctuary, and now my victory. As darkness settled, I poured myself another cup of coffee and looked out over the water, thinking about how absurd and exhausting the past weeks had been. And yet, despite the chaos, the confrontation, and the tension, it had all led to this: a perfect moment of peace and triumph. I smiled to myself, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The cabin was mine, the beach was mine, and the freedom to enjoy it without interference was finally restored. The battle with the HOA was over, and I had won, not through confrontation, but through patience, preparation, and the simple power of truth. And as the last rays of the sun disappeared over the horizon, I whispered quietly to the waves, "This is my place, my beach, my peace, and nothing, not even Karen, can change that." Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.